Chapter 26 of Howard's End. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Kristen McQuillan. Howard's End by Edward Morgan Forster. Chapter 26. Next morning a fine mist covered the peninsula. The weather promised well, and the outline of the castle mound grew clearer each moment that Margaret watched it. Presently she saw the keep, and the sun painted the rubble gold and charged the white sky with blue. The shadow of the house gathered itself together and fell over the garden. A cat looked up at her window and mewed. Lastly the river appeared, still holding the mists between its banks and its overhanging alders, and only visible as far as a hill which cut off its upper reaches. Margaret was fascinated by Onnington. She had said that she loved it, but it was rather its romantic tension that held her. The rounded Druids of whom she had caught glimpses in her drive, the rivers hurrying down from them to England, the carelessly modelled masses of the lower hills thrilled her with poetry. The house was insignificant, but the prospect from it would be an eternal joy, and she thought of all the friends that she would have to stop in it, and of the conversion of Henry himself to a rural life. Society, too, promised favourably. The rector of the parish had dined with them last night, and she had found that he was a friend of her father's, and so knew what to find in her. She liked him. He would introduce her to the town, while on the other side Sir James Bidder sat, repeating that she had only to give the word, and he would whip up the country families for 20 miles round. Whether Sir James, who was Garden Seeds, had promised what he could perform she doubted, but so long as Henry mistook them for the country families when they did call, she was content. Charles and Albert Fussell now crossed the lawn. They were going for a morning dip, and a servant followed them with their bathing dresses. She had meant to take a stroll herself before breakfast, but she saw that the day was still sacred to men, and amused herself by watching their contretemps. In the first place, the key of the bathing shed could not be found. Charles stood by the riverside with folded hands, tragical, while the servant shouted and was misunderstood by another servant in the garden. Then came a difficulty about a springboard, and soon 3 people were running backwards and forwards over the meadow with orders and counter-orders and recriminations and apologies. If Margaret wanted to jump from a motor car, she jumped. If Tibby thought paddling would benefit his ankles, he paddled. If a clerk desired adventure, he took a walk in the dark. But these athletes seemed paralyzed. They could not bathe without their appliances, though the morning sun was calling and the last mists were rising from the dimpling stream. Had they found the life of the body after all? Could not the men whom they despised as milksops beat them even on their own ground? She thought of the bathing arrangements as they should be in her day. No worrying of servants, no appliances. Beyond good sense. Her reflections were disturbed by the quiet child, who had come to speak to the cat, but was now watching her watch the men. She called, "Good morning, dear," a little sharply. Her voice spread consternation. Charles looked round, and though completely attired in indigo blue, vanished into the shed and was seen no more. "Miss Wilcox is up," the child whispered, and then became unintelligible. "What's that?" It sounded like "cut yoke, sack back." "I can't hear." "On the bed, tissue paper." Gathering that the wedding dress was on view and a visit would be seemly, she went to Evie's room. All was hilarity here. Evie, in a petticoat, was dancing with one of the Anglo-Indian ladies, while the other was adoring yards of white satin. They screamed, they laughed, they sang, and the dog barked. Margaret screamed a little too, but without conviction. She could not feel that a wedding was so funny. Perhaps something was missing in her equipment. Evie gasped, "Dolly, is it rotter not to be here? Oh, we would rag just then." Then Margaret went down to breakfast. Henry was already installed. He ate slowly and spoke little, and was, in Margaret's eyes, the only member of their party who dodged emotion successfully. She could not suppose him indifferent to either the loss of his daughter or the presence of his future wife. Yet he dwelt in tact, only issuing orders occasionally, orders that promoted the comfort of his guests. He inquired after her hand. He set her to pour out the coffee, and Mrs. Warrington to pour out the tea. When Evie came down there was a moment's awkwardness, and both ladies rose to vacate their places. "Burton," called Henry, "serve tea and coffee from the sideboard." It wasn't genuine tact, but it was tact of a sort. The sort that is as useful as the genuine, and saves even more situations at board meetings. Henry treated a marriage like a funeral, item by item, never raising his eyes to the whole, and "Death, where's thy sting? Love, where's thy victory?" one would exclaim at the close. After breakfast she claimed a few words with him. It was always best to approach him formally. She asked for the interview because he was going on to shoot grouse tomorrow, and she was returning to Helen in town. "Certainly, dear," he said. "Of course I have the time. What do you want?" "Nothing." "I was afraid something had gone wrong." "No, I have nothing to say, but you may talk." Glancing at his watch, he talked of the nasty curve at the lich gate. She heard him with interest. Her surface could always respond to his without contempt, though all her deeper being might be yearning to help him. She had abandoned any plan of action. Love is the best, and the more she let herself love him, the more chance was there that he would set his soul in order. Such a moment as this, when they sat under fair weather by the walks of their future home, was so sweet to her that its sweetness would surely pierce to him. Each lift of his eyes, each parting of the thatched lip from the clean-shaven, must prelude the tenderness that kills the monk and the beast at a single blow. Disappointed 100 times, she still hoped. She loved him with too clear a vision to fear his cloudiness. Whether he droned trivialities as today, or sprang kisses on her in the twilight, she could pardon him, she could respond. "If there is this nasty curve," she suggested, "couldn't we walk to the church? Not, of course, you and Evie, but the rest of us might very well go on first, and that would mean fewer carriages." "One can't have ladies walking through the market square. The Fussells wouldn't like it. They were awfully particular at Charles's wedding. One of our party, was anxious to walk, and certainly the church was just round the corner, and I shouldn't have minded, but the Colonel made a great point of it." "You men shouldn't be so chivalrous," said Margaret thoughtfully. "Why not?" She knew why not, but said that she didn't know. He announced that, unless she had anything special to say, he must visit the wine cellar, and they went off together in search of Burton. Though clumsy and a little inconvenient, Oniton was a genuine country house. They clattered down flagged passages, looking into room after room and scaring unknown maids from the performance of obscure duties. The wedding breakfast must be in readiness when they came back from church, and tea would be served in the garden. The sight of so many agitated and serious people made Margaret smile, but she reflected that they were paid to be serious, and enjoyed being agitated. Here were the lower wheels of the machine that was tossing Evie into nuptial glory. A little boy blocked their way with pigtails. His mind could not grasp their greatness, and he said, "By your leave, let me pass, please." Henry asked him where Burton was, but the servants were so new that they did not know one another's names. In the still-room sat the band, who had stipulated for champagne as part of their fee, and who were already drinking beer. Scents of Araby came from the kitchen, mingled with cries. Margaret knew what had happened there, for it happened at Wickham Place. One of the wedding dishes had boiled over, and the cook was throwing cedar shavings to hide the smell. At last they came upon the butler. Henry gave him the keys and handed Margaret down the cellar stairs. 2 doors were unlocked. She, who kept all her wine at the bottom of the linen cupboard, was astonished at the sight. "We shall never get through it," she cried, and the 2 men were suddenly drawn into brotherhood and exchanged smiles. She felt as if she had again jumped out of the car while it was moving. Certainly Oniton would take some digesting. It would be no small business to remain herself and yet to assimilate such an establishment. She must remain herself, for his sake as well as her own, since a shadowy wife degrades the husband whom she accompanies, and she must assimilate for reasons of common honesty, since she had no right to marry a man and make him uncomfortable. Her only ally was the power of home. The loss of Wickham Place had taught her more than its possession. Howard's End had repeated the lesson. She was determined to create new sanctities among these hills. After visiting the wine cellar, she dressed, and then came the wedding, which seemed a small affair when compared with the preparations for it. Everything went like 1 o'clock. Mr. Cahill materialized out of space, and was waiting for his bride at the church door. No one dropped the ring, or mispronounced the responses, or trod on Evie's train, or cried. In a few minutes the clergymen performed their duty, the register was signed, and they were back in their carriages, negotiating the dangerous curve by the lich gate. Margaret was convinced that they had not been married at all, and that the Norman Church had been intent all the time on other business. There were more documents to sign at the house, and the breakfast to eat, and then a few more people dropped in for the garden party. There had been a great many refusals. After all, it was not a very big affair, not as big as Margaret's would